So our paper is going to be Cannibal Crickets on a Forced March for Protein and Salt. This paper was written by Stephen J. Simpson and all. I'm Andrew Mark.
I'm Steven.
And I'm Karina.
One of the main ideas involved in this paper is going to be swarming. And with these insects that we're studying, the bands are composed of millions of individuals with densities of 100 per square meter. Some of the background information on this study is that swarming and mass migration are thought to be responsible by depletion of food. And some of the models that we have currently are untested, so the study is very important as opposed to discovering new scientific information. The study does focus on Mormon crickets and their en masse movement. And with radio tracking, they were able to prove that smaller bands are more susceptible to predation, whereas when they travel in larger groups, they're more likely to deplete their resources, and that's what leads to cannibalism. So right here we have a video of the migration, and when they are migrating these big groups, they're capable of traveling up to 2 kilometers in a day. And when they're crossing the roads like this, they're really vulnerable to getting run over. And when individuals get run over, they're more likely to be cannibalized. And when they stop being cannibalized, again, it's just like a cycling effect. So more individuals get run over, and then ultimately it just becomes a hazard. So these are Mormon crickets, and contrary to the name, they're not actual true crickets. They don't fly or anything like that. When they do need to transport, they either crawl or they hop. And then lastly, we have cannibalism. So as far as their diet goes, the crickets are omnivorous, and they'll eat just about anything that they can ingest. And sometimes that does include each other. And part of the study is focused on why they do cannibalize each other. So some of the specific questions concerning the study are what resources drive the cannibalism and collective movement of the Mormon crickets, as well as does movement by individual Mormon crickets within the migratory band reduce the risk of being cannibalized?
So the first thing that the scientists wanted to do was to conduct initial field observations. This took place in southern Idaho, where they found a 1 kilometer long band of Mormon crickets. And so they suspected that the Mormon crickets would need ample sources of protein, carbohydrates, and salts, to live. So they observed their feeding behavior and found that the crickets did feed on protein-rich grasses. They fed on the urine of cows, so you have the minerals in there. And they also confirmed cannibalistic activities such as eating their own exoskeleton and members of the same band of their own species. And so the first thing that the second thing that they did was determine the preference for protein versus carbohydrate. And so they took 4 petri dishes and filled them with granular diets. Each diet consisted of different percentages of protein versus carbohydrate, with the highest being 42% and the lowest being 0%. You can see that down at the bottom there with their corresponding diet label. And so as the crickets came in, you could see that whichever had the most crickets was preferred more.
So what they found was illustrated here on the x-axis. They had the different kinds of diets the crickets were exposed to, and the y is the percent of insects that went to each dish. And it's pretty clear that the insects had a high preference for the protein-containing diets. It didn't care much at all for the diets that had just carbs or neither protein or carbs.
And so next they wanted to take these results and see whether or not they consisted or continued for the long term. So they took crickets from the band and they placed them in individually housed containers with either the 42% protein or 42% carbohydrate diets. And so they observed this intake over 48 hours. And these dishes were pre-weighed, so every time after 28 hours there were new dishes added to the observation unit. And so that at the end they could determine which was eaten the most over time. And so the first trial that they did this, they were crickets in their instar stage, so they were still developing, more on the juvenile stage. And then the second trial was with adult crickets.
So what we have here is the protein eaten on the x-axis and the carbs eaten on the y. The line going through the middle represents the 1-to-1 ratio of protein to carbs, and we have A and B representing 2 different groups of crickets, the A being juvenile crickets and the B being adult crickets. And after day 1 for A, they had eaten slightly more of the carbs and protein, and after day 2, they'd eaten significantly more of the carbs. For B, it worked slightly differently, but same idea. But they originally ate much more of the protein than carbs, but after they passed a certain point, they did begin to eat more carbs than protein.
So next they wanted to determine the preference for different concentrations of salt versus water. So they took these 6 petri dishes and filled them with these wool-soaked concentrations of sodium chloride, and these concentrations ranged from 2 molar to just water. And as the crickets came in, they could see again which one was preferred the most by the crickets. And these were also randomized locations per trial, so it wasn't just, maybe a certain patch of grass that was preferred. It was actually the concentration.
So we have the sodium chlorine concentration on the x-axis and the percent of insects at each dish on the y. And as you can see, there's a clear preference for the 0.25 molar of the sodium chloride.
And so next they wanted to determine the effects of protein and salt abundance on cannibalism. So they took insects from the field and housed them, and they gave them different diets. For the protein, they fed them on one of the 4 different diets that we mentioned earlier. And for the salt, they fed them the 0.25 molar and the protein-rich grass that they had from the field in the initial observations. And so after this initial, experiment, they put it into another container with a freshly wounded cricket. And after 15 minutes, they came back and scored on a scale of 0 to 5 the extent of cannibalism of the injured cricket. And you might think that this is pretty subjective, a pretty subjective scale. But later they came back and they reported the mass of insects before and after the cannibalism took place. And they correlated this with the scores that they gave, that they individually scored the crickets. And they found that this was pretty consistent across the board.
So here we have the amount of victim eaten on the x-axis and the cases where cannibalism exceeded, the value on the x-axis on the y. And what they found was that the salt-deprived crickets ate more of their victim than the ones that were salt-replete, and same goes for the protein-deprived. They ate more of their victim than the protein-replete crickets.
So one of the last things that they did was they studied protein abundance and its effect on locomotion. So they took crickets and again housed them into individual containers, and they watched them at 1-minute intervals for 7 hours, and they tracked their movement patterns given different granular diets, either the protein, carbohydrate, or PC, which is the 21% of each.
So what they found was that crickets that had protein in their diet walked 50% less than the crickets that did not have protein. And this is represented here. We have the hours walking during diet treatment and the minutes spent walking per hour. And the crickets that were based off the carbohydrate diet spent significantly more time walking than the crickets that had protein.
So the last thing that they checked in their experiment was movement as a defense. So they took these crickets and essentially hot glued them to a flat stone. And the other half of the crickets, they did the same thing, except these were dead. And so for half of the live half of the crickets, they could move their legs, but they couldn't exactly walk away. And you could be sure that the other half wasn't moving at all.
So what they found was that the crickets that were alive but attached to the stone would attack against the crickets trying to cannibalize them by kicking them with their back legs.
And so once they saw this observation in the videos, they suddenly have the opportunity to better quantify movement as a defense. So they came up with these 4 different groups. Group, I guess, Roman numeral 2 here, you could see that the crickets were alive and, had 4, or I guess all of its legs functional. Another had 1 severed leg, another had 2 severed legs, and the last one was dead, so no leg function there. And so as the crickets came in, they could see which ones were more likely to be cannibalized over others.
So what they found basically was that the less crickets were able to move, the more likely they were to be cannibalized. So all 14 of the dead insects were eaten. Only 1 of the alive and undamaged ones were eaten. 5 out of the 14 ones with both legs damaged survived, and 11 out of 14 of the insects missing 1 back leg survived. So now we're going to go through and discuss the applications of these results. So back when we discussed the different diet experiments, the first one was showing that they had a short-term preference for protein, but the second one illustrated that they had a long-term preference for carbs. This is significant because it means that they aren't just naturally drawn to the protein. If they were naturally drawn to it, they would have a preference for it in both situations. However, since they only preferred it when it was in the short term without abundance of resources, it does convey that they did have a deficiency in protein.
Next is the salt deficiency. We saw that there was a very clear preference for the 0.25 molar, but this is also significant because the 0.25 molar of sodium chloride also corresponds to the relative abundance of sodium chloride in the Mormon cricket's exoskeletons. So this is another reason for the cannibalistic activities given deficiencies of certain macronutrients.
So they also found that these protein and salt deficiencies did drive cannibalism, which means that they were cannibalizing other crickets in order to make up for this lack of nutrients. They also found that because of this protein deprivation, it did motivate them to travel in these bands in search of this, so they were being pulled by this lack of protein and salt.
And so, like CJ said from before, you also have this pull of the migratory band forward because of the abundance of proteins and sodium chloride in front of the band. But you also have this push from cannibalism behind the band because if you fall back, you're more likely to be cannibalized, like we saw with the protein abundance versus locomotion, and with the crickets being able to move their back legs.
And so after reading this paper and analyzing the results, we did decide on some things they could do afterwards. And one of the things they could test is how will climate change influence the mass migration in Mormon crickets. Another thing that we thought about was, are male or female Mormon crickets more likely to be susceptible to the cannibalism? And lastly, will an abundance of protein/minerals slow Mormon crickets band substantially? And then our group question was, is it ethical to mitigate the natural instincts of migratory species in favor of domestic interest?